There was a time when Superman didn't rely on spectacle, and didn't need to. No billion-dollar budgets, no digital flight, no shared universe, just a man, a cape, and the weight of an idea. These early portrayals didn't have modern scale, but they had something just as powerful. Presence. The way he stood, the way he spoke, the way people believed him when he said truth and justice still mattered. Over the decades, a few men took on that role, some for years, others just briefly, and each brought something essential: sincerity, quiet strength, a sense of conviction that felt human, not just heroic. Long before the role became part of a global franchise, it was already something iconic, a symbol that didn't need effects to leave an impact. This is a look back at the actors who helped shape the legend, who wore the cape when Superman didn't share the spotlight, but carried it. They weren't perfect, some were typecast, some became icons, but all of them helped define the character, not just with powers, but with presence. Before Superman belonged to Hollywood, he belonged to Saturday matinees. In 1948, audiences watched a man leap over buildings, not with wires or digital effects, but with comic book cuts and clever editing. It was rough around the edges, sure. The budget was tight, but for the kids in the audience, it didn't matter. Superman had arrived. The man behind the cape was Kirk Alyn, a former Broadway dancer and World War II veteran who, almost by accident, became the first actor to bring the Man of Steel to life on screen. He starred in 2 Columbia serials, Superman, 1948, and Atom Man vs. Superman, 1950. Each ran in short weekly chapters, playing before feature films in theaters across America. Alyn didn't have much to work with. The flying scenes were hand-drawn animation. The sound effects were minimal. Most of the time, it was just him, walking into frame, standing tall, and trusting the audience to believe what they were seeing. But what he brought was commitment. There was a sincerity in the way he played both Superman and Clark Kent, wide-eyed, upright, and slightly theatrical. It was less about realism and more about tone. And in that tone, Alyn struck something essential, a version of the character that felt mythic but approachable. He wasn't famous for the role. In fact, he wasn't even credited as Superman in the first serial. The studio wanted to maintain the illusion that Superman was real and Kirk Alyn was just a stand-in. But fans knew, and in fan circles, his performance became a cult favorite. He only wore the cape for a few years. After the serials ended, Alyn faded from the spotlight. But he remained proud of his place in Superman history, often attending conventions in his later years and embracing the legacy he helped start. He may not have had the best special effects, but he was the first to walk into that frame and make the cape mean something. In a way, that was the hardest part, because once the legend begins, every step after that has to measure up. If Kirk Alyn brought Superman to the big screen, George Reeves brought him home. In 1952, Adventures of Superman premiered on television, and for the first time, audiences didn't have to buy a movie ticket to see the Man of Steel. They just had to switch on the TV. And there he was, broad-shouldered, calm-voiced, standing in black and white with hands on hips, ready to fix whatever needed fixing. Reeves had a presence that was instantly reassuring. He played him like a neighbor, dependable, fair, and always 2 steps ahead of trouble. He smiled often, he explained things clearly, and in a decade that idealized simplicity and order, that was exactly what viewers wanted. The costume was basic, the effects were minimal, but none of that mattered. Reeves filled the screen with something even more important: trust. As Clark Kent, he wasn't bumbling or shy, he was confident. Not just a disguise, but a version of the same character in a different uniform. The duality wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about showing that strength could be gentle and that power could also mean restraint. And yet, off-screen, the story was more complicated. George Reeves became deeply associated with the role, too much so. After the series ended, he struggled to find new work. Casting directors couldn't see past the cape, and in 1959, he died under circumstances that still stir questions. Officially ruled a suicide, but surrounded by speculation. His death cast a shadow over the role for years, but the legacy he left behind never faded. For millions of children, George Reeves was the Superman, the one who made house calls through TV screens, the one who didn't need special effects to seem heroic, the one who made it feel like Superman might actually exist somewhere just outside the frame. He wasn't the first, but for a generation, he was the one who mattered most. Every version of Superman before him helped build the legend, but Christopher Reeve made it feel real. When Superman the movie premiered in 1978, it didn't just bring the character to the big screen. It proved that the myth could work in live action. Not because of the special effects, which were impressive for the time, but because of Reeve himself. He wore the costume with ease, but more than that, he carried it with sincerity. There was no irony, no wink at the audience. His Superman was noble without being rigid, kind without being naive. He radiated calm, strength, and compassion, all without ever needing to overplay it. And then there was Clark Kent, where Reeve pulled off something rare. With subtle changes in posture, tone, and timing, he created a character that felt entirely separate from Superman. Slouched shoulders, a slightly higher voice, hesitant glances, no mask, no disguise, just brilliant physical acting. And it worked. Across 4 films: Superman, 1978, Superman the Second, 1980, Superman the Third, 1983, and Superman the Fourth, 1987, he brought remarkable consistency to a character that could have easily drifted into parody. Even when the scripts weakened, he stayed grounded, always present, always committed. Then years later, life changed dramatically. In 1995, Reeves suffered a spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed. But instead of retreating from public life, he became something even greater. A powerful voice for research, accessibility, and hope. A real-world symbol of resilience, different from Superman but no less inspiring. For many, he remains the definitive version of the character. Not because of the cape or the physicality, but because of what he stood for, in fiction and in reality. Christopher Reeve didn't just portray Superman, he understood him, and in doing so became a lasting part of the mythology himself. After Christopher Reeve, it was hard to imagine anyone else in the cape. But in 1988, television tried something new, or rather something younger. Superboy premiered in syndication with the goal of reintroducing the character to a new generation. This wasn't Clark Kent at the Daily Planet. It was Clark in College, a prequel, a reimagining, and a bridge between 2 versions of the myth. 2 actors wore the suit across the show's 4-season run. John Haymes Newton played Clark in the first season, earnest, clean-cut, and full of optimism. Then, starting in season 2, Gerard Christopher took over, bringing a more confident, slightly more mature energy to the role. The series leaned into comic book plots, aliens, secret labs, Lex Luthor experiments. The tone shifted from light to darker as it went on. The effects were simple, the sets were modest, but the effort was clear. It was a Superman world being built on a TV budget, and somehow they made it work. What Superboy lacked in spectacle, it made up for in commitment. The actors took the role seriously. The scripts, while sometimes campy, still tried to explore what it meant to live a double life, to be powerful and yet hidden. It never reached the popularity of the earlier films or shows, and over time, it slipped out of public memory. But for kids watching TV in the late 80s and early 90s, this was their Superman, or at least the version that showed up after school. There was something charming in its simplicity. No irony, no reboots, just a young man in a bright suit trying to do the right thing. And for a series that rarely gets mentioned today, Superboy quietly held the torch for 4 seasons, keeping the symbol alive until someone else was ready to wear it. By the early 1990s, Superman had gone quiet, the films had faded, the comics were shifting, and the world was changing. But in 1993, television brought him back, not with explosions or mythology, but with a title that said everything: Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. This was Superman reimagined for prime time, a love story, a workplace comedy, a superhero series that kept the cape, but focused on the man underneath. At the center was Dean Cain, a former athlete turned actor, stepping into the suit with a smile that felt familiar, but a tone that was completely new. His Superman wasn't distant or untouchable. He was warm, grounded, accessible. The strength was still there, but the edge was gone. Instead of myth, the show leaned into personality, and Cain's performance reflected that perfectly. As Clark Kent, he was charming, confident, quick with a joke. As Superman, he was more thoughtful than commanding. And for a new generation, especially one raised more on sitcoms than serials, that balance worked. Alongside Terry Hatcher's sharp, smart, and career-focused Lois Lane, the show created a dynamic that felt fresh. Not damsel and savior, but equals, partners. And when the world around them went strange, as it often did, they stayed grounded in the one thing Superman stories often overlook: connection. The special effects were modest, the villains sometimes forgettable, but none of that mattered, because Lois and Clark wasn't about spectacle. It was about identity, about the idea that Superman's greatest challenge wasn't a monster or a meteor. It was learning how to live among us without losing who he was. Dean Cain's version might not be the most mythic, but for many viewers, he was the most relatable. The Superman who didn't just fly, he smiled, he listened, he stayed.